Good afternoon. My name is Trish Balamingi, and on behalf of the Environmental Studies Association of Canada and the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies here at Carleton University, I would like to welcome you to our 2009 Keynote Address. Thank you all for coming. I know there are multiple competing sessions going on, and we appreciate your attendance at this important event. It is my great pleasure to introduce Frances Moore-Lappé. Frances is a democracy advocate and world food and hunger expert who has authored or co-authored 16 books. She is co-founder of 3 organizations, including Food First, the Institute for Food and Development Policy, and more recently, the Small Planet Institute, a collaborative network for research and popular education aimed at bringing democracy to life, which she leads with her daughter, Anna Lappé. In 1987, she received the Right Livelihood Award, otherwise known as the Alternative Nobel. Her first book, Diet for a Small Planet, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, has sold 3 million copies and is considered the blueprint for eating with a small carbon footprint long before the term was coined. Her most recent work, Getting a Grip, Clarity, Creativity, and Courage in a World Gone Mad, which is a lovely book, garnered the Nautilus Gold Best in Small Press Award. In June 2008, that book and Diet for a Small Planet were designated as must-reads for now US President Barack Obama by Barbara Kingsolver and Michael Pollan, respectively. Frances has received 17 honorary doctorates from distinguished institutions. She has been a visiting scholar at MIT in Cambridge and Suffolk University in Boston. She has taught on the roots of world hunger with Dr. Vandana Shiva and a course on living democracy at Schumacher College in England. In 2006, she was chosen as a founding counselor of the Hamburg-based World Future Council. She is also a member of the International Commission on the Future of Food and Agriculture and the National Advisory Council of the Union of Concerned Scientists. She serves as an advisor to the Calgary Centre for Global Community and on the board of David Korten's People-Centered Development Forum. Frances received the 2008 James Beard Foundation Humanitarian of the Year Award for her lifelong impact on the way people all over the world think about food, nutrition, and agriculture. Her most recent book, Getting a Grip, as well as Diet for a Small Planet, you may have seen is available for sale through the Carlton bookstore, and Frances has kindly agreed to remain after her talk and after the question and answer session if you would like to have those books signed. I will pass around a sign-up sheet for friends of Frances Moore-Lappé and Anna Lappé, and Frances promises these are occasional updates, not monthly but closer to quarterly, about the important work that she's doing through the Small Planet Institute. So please join me and bear with us as we transfer the microphones. Please join me in warmly welcoming Frances Moore-Lappé.
I was just saying that I've been in Germany for a couple of weeks, and it's just so nice to be talking to people who understand what I'm saying. Because everything I said had to be translated from into German. So, but that's not the only reason I'm happy to be in Canada. Actually, I will say this without pandering to my audience. I have had the most ecstatic speaking experiences of my life in Canada. I've had the greatest sense of connection with any other place I've been, including my very first book tour with Diet for a Small Planet. Your media was the first person among your media was a person who was the first person in the media I had ever encountered who'd actually read my book before asking me questions. And I thought, oh, you mean media actually read the books before? Oh, that's interesting. So I come very happy to be here today, and very happy to share this with you. And let me say, I appreciate it so much, Trish, you're making this happen, adjusting to me in so many ways. And I wanted also to let you know before I begin that Anna and I work very much in conversation with people. And Anna is my daughter. She's just finishing a book on food and climate change, which I hope you will look for, called Diet for a Hot Planet. And but I say this because we have this e-letter that as I say, it's sort of inspirationally. It's kind of quarterly, but basically we send it out when we're excited about what we're doing and want to share it with people. And among the things we hope happens, and it has sometimes very, very substantially, is that we ask people to give us feedback. And for example, this book just mentioned, Getting a Grip. I had a team of maybe a dozen people I didn't know who gave me great feedback on the draft. So we'd love it if any of you were so interested as you see our e-letter or go to our website, Small Planet, and would like to be in the loop. Please, you are welcome into our loop. So the talk I'm giving today is a work in progress that I call Liberation Ecology. And I want to share with you, as I say, a set of ideas, and I hope they will trigger your response. Because I start with this observation that, like they say, if you're not frightened, you're not paying attention kind of thing. I mean, I look around as you do. We know that global heating, I love to call it global heating, not warming, because if you live in the Northeast in the US, warming sounds kind of nice. So I call it global heating is happening faster than the experts said even a couple of years ago. And we know that we're losing a species a day. We know now in world hunger that we've been set back decades just in the last couple of years. So how do I get a grip? And I really strongly believe, or I wouldn't be standing here kind of bouncing up and down with you, if I didn't believe that we could, despite all these negative trend lines, if we couldn't make this turn toward life. And so I ask, what is it that is standing in our way? Why are we continuing down? And taught by many great thinkers, greater than I, over the decades, I've come to see that what is really standing in our way is ideas. That ideas are more powerful than instincts is the thesis underlying everything I'm saying. And we can argue about that in the Q&A, but I think I have pretty good evidence. So I'm saying if the solutions are known, and I'm going to briefly just throw out a couple of things to give you my sense of that, I'm arguing that, look, the solutions are not only known, the solutions to multiple problems assaulting us, but they're right in front of our noses. So if the solutions are there and we're not going for it, why? And I'm suggesting in this talk that there are ideas out there that we absorb like an invisible ether that tie our hands, that make us feel powerless. And the goal I have today is to help break us free from disempowering ideas, so that not only do we feel more empowered ourselves, but in all that each of you is an educator, each human being is an educator, because everybody's watching everybody moment to moment, so that we can be more effective. That's my goal. So you'll have to tell me if you think I achieve it. So just on the solutions, I mean, in a couple of minutes, I can't prove to you that solutions are known, but just a little hint of what I mean by this is that, I've been a student of Amory Lovin's, an American physicist, for years and years. And he points out that even if we moved off of fossil fuels at 2/3 the rate that we achieved during the first oil crisis from late 70s to mid 80s, we would be able to get completely off fossil fuel in just a few decades. I think of Sweden, for example, that has already achieved 77% off of fossil fuel for meeting its energy needs. Then I jump to poverty. Poverty. And we know how to solve poverty. Just in the US, which is one of the countries that has been least successful, but even in the US, in the 1960s, we cut the poverty rate in half in 1 decade. It doesn't take a PhD in economics to figure it out. The solutions are known. So I'm arguing then that if the solutions are right in front of us, why aren't we manifesting these solutions? what is it that makes us feel powerless? And so I'm arguing, as I've already said, that there's a set of ideas that we absorb unconsciously, and that that's okay if the mental maps through which human beings see the world are life-serving, but that you and I are alive in this extraordinary moment when the dominant mental map is fundamentally life-destroying. And so my argument is that all the great, many great teachers, as well as now neuroscience, is telling us there's no unfiltered reality. We all are seeing the world through blinders. And so the best we can do is to make sure that our blinders are intelligent ones. I mean, in a sense, we all carry a set of ideas which determine what we can see and what we cannot see. But I believe now in this crucial moment, this moment of psychic dissonance when the old mental map doesn't seem to be serving us, and even Alan Greenspan, our head of our Federal Reserve, is telling us that his worldview has been shaken, that in such a time when the old ideas begin to crack, the walls begin to crack, that we can see through and start to consciously construct more life-serving ideas. So let me just say, today I want to just take on 5 of the dominant messages of at least parts of the environmental movement that I want to ask us to look at critically. But underneath this shift from disempowering ideas to more empowering ideas is this observation that you and I have grown up in a world which has been locked into, in general terms, a mechanical worldview in which we see things as fixed and as scarce. If you've studied economics, you know that the science of economics is all about how do we share, how do we use, how do we make a life in a world of scarce resources. So it's fixed things that are, by definition, scarce. And what is emerging is something quite different. And in a sense, each of these ideas, these 5, help shift us from this dominant sense of a world in which, based on not enough, I say it's a world centered on the premise of not enough of anything, from food to energy to parking places, and not enough goods, and also not enough goodness, that we absorb the idea that we are simply this selfish little shopper beneath it all, that we are selfish, competitive, and materialistic, and if you peel away the fluff, that's all you can really count on in human nature. So I'm suggesting then that this worldview that we have inherited, that is based on this sense of lack of goods and goodness, grounds us in a sense of fear of being without. And what is emerging, and I think it's a much more accurate way of understanding the reality of the world and the human place in it, is what I think of as the ecological worldview, which is not based on separate and finished and fixed and scarce, but on continuous movement, co-creation, and interrelationships, not separate and finished and done and scarce, but relatedness that is constantly co-creating. In other words, from an ecological worldview, I believe that we can see a sense of possibility that we cannot see in the inherited mechanical worldview. So this shift that I'm talking about, that is embodied in these ideas that I'm going to get to in a second, it can seem like a huge thing. Here's this woman saying that we're going to make this historic shift. But before, I just want to remind you that since I was born in 1944, humanity has used 2 times the energy, it's estimated, than in all previous history. In other words, it's a window we're talking about in which the most egregious damage is being done. Since I was a teenager, half of the increase in the atmospheric carbon has happened since I was a teenager. That was a long time ago, but not that long. I mean, I'm 65. Yes, it was a long time ago. But in the scope of human history, it's a wink, it's a blink. It's an aberration. It's like, instead of thinking this is it, I think more usefully, we've skidded off the road. This is an aberration. This is a freak show that we've been in for my lifetime, pretty much, since post-World War II. It's not working. But I think it's helpful to remind us that this hasn't been going on that long, the worst of it, at least. So, now then, what are the 5 disempowering messages that I think we have to reshape? Let me say first, it's very simple. The first that I see a lot is the framing of power down. There's a book by that name. It's the sense that, we have to turn the lights out, and there's this big international moment. What's it called? Anyway, the Earth Hour, where we turn out the lights. But the idea that this power down idea, the descent, I know in some of the transition towns they're using that language of descent. I want to challenge this framing and the language around it. Even a new ecological economics textbook, which I was so excited existed, ecological economics, it sounds good. But authors say, for example, fossil fuels freed us from the fixed flow of energy from the sun. Fossil fuels freed us from the fixed energy flow. Wait a minute. That notion that, we've got to power down because we've had all of this great freedom, actually, no. I'm saying that what has trapped us is fossil fuel. Because if you look at where is energy, think of the estimate from German energy expert Hermann Scheer, who reminds us that every day the sun supplies us with 15,000 times the amount of energy that we're now using in fossil fuels. So fixed energy flow, basically, we shouldn't call the sun's energy renewable. It is simply renewing. We can't stop it. And we've only begun to tap that source. So it's really important, I believe, to recognize that rather than the fossil fuel having freed us, what if it turns out that we look centuries forward, we look back on this era and we say, oh my God, we were trapped because fossil fuels are so concentrated, their extraction costs so much money, that they so concentrated social power that basically they enslaved the humanity. And you don't even have to live in Nigeria to feel it, right? When you see the power of our oil companies, I mean, that's maybe one of the worst examples, but to think of how once power is understood in this concentrated form that fossil fuels are, then we're all made these weak customers of a few companies. And so Exxon of last year was making, I believe it was $1,200 a second in profit, $1,300 a second. So I'm saying if we flip that and think that, in fact, fossil fuels are what have trapped us, and the release to tap into the sun's energy directly in a distributed way, where we all participate in energy generation, that can be that can be the real freedom. So let me just say, though, that there's a very, very closely related message here, and that is the one that we have hit the Earth's limits, and we must move from growth to no growth, growth to no growth. We hear that quite often. And again, I feel like it really misses the mark. Most fundamentally because it honors what we've been doing during this aberration as growth. But think about it. The New York Times said recently that 56 or 7% of all energy use in all energy produced in the United States is wasted. Amory Lovins again estimates that in the US, our automobiles waste 87% of the energy that are used to get us from here to there. I think of food. In the US, at least, I've seen estimates from 1/4 to a half of the food produced is wasted. I just read a piece in today's paper Robert Kennedy Jr. said, just as part of another piece he was writing in the Times, pointed out that in the US, each of us throws out 300 pounds of packaging every year. I mean, think that's close to a pound of packaging a day per person. It seemed almost unbelievable. So I'm saying, let's not call this growth. This isn't growth. This is huge destruction and waste. And calling it growth is really distorting reality. We should call it what it is, a destructive and wasteful economic system that is creating scarcity, absolute scarcity for so many. And that what we should call growth, and the only thing that we should call growth, is that which enhances life. We can't turn growth into a swear word, because I want my grandbaby, I don't want her to grow, I want her to stay 3. But, in general, we want our flowers to grow, we want our hearts to grow in love. Let's call what we have been doing waste and destruction, and call growth that which enhances life. So, where am I? So basically what I'm suggesting then is that, here I am. Okay, that this process of waste and destruction, which we've been misnaming, is how did that get to be? That got to be by an economy, our economic ideas, that is the peculiar belief that our economies could run driven by essentially one rule. And that is highest return to existing wealth. People who already own the shares in companies and people who run them. So that we have a world today in which billionaires, or the number of billionaires, is increasing 8 times faster than the overall economies in the world. And in the US, there is now one family. As a result of this one rule economy, there is now one family that controls as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans put together. Do you know who that is? Yes, this first time. I knew you all were better than other audiences. The Waltons, it's true. It's the first time anybody's gotten it right off like that. But 40%. So what I'm saying is that what I'm calling this economy of waste and destruction, it flows not from some inherent greediness of human beings, but because we've set the rules up. And we should have learned it when we played Monopoly as kids. Because what happens when we play Monopoly is that by the end of the evening, or some evening along the way, the game's over, because one person has all the property. And usually it was my brother in my family, and I was kind of relieved because I was pretty tired. And it works in a game, but it doesn't work in life. It means people die. It means people live in absolute what is it? 16 to 30,000 children will die today because of deprivation. So this one rule economy, this peculiar idea that there's only one way to run a market, is now being challenged. We are beginning to rethink, and maybe we'll go back to the inside. Actually, monopoly was invented by a very well-meaning Quaker lady in the early 20th century, who created this board game to teach us what happens. And we didn't learn the lesson. But maybe now with global economic collapse, we might, her name is Lizzie Maggie, so maybe she should be our new heroine. Yes, we're listening, Lizzie, now, finally. So I'm suggesting then that we end up then, as this one rule economy leads to such intense concentration of wealth as these numbers represent, they then infuse and influence public decision making. So we have what I've come to call, in the United States at least, privately held government. And it sounds like a really strange oxymoron, but that is what happens when we now have about $16 million a day, estimated by Harper's Magazine, spent on lobbying, and there are now 24 lobbyists in Washington for every one person that each U.S. citizen has sent there to represent us. So in that sense, then, this world gone mad of increasing waste and destruction continues, and we feel increasingly disempowered because we don't see the ideas that are keeping that economic structure in place. So the solutions then from this economy of waste and destruction, driven by a one rule economy that ends up not only concentrating wealth but distorting political decision making, is what I'm going to come to at the end of this talk, which is the idea of democracy as a living process, a culture in which economic life is re-embedded in community where it has been through most of human evolution. But as soon as I begin talking like that, then the third disempowering idea I feel is hanging out there. And that is the assumption that too many of us absorb, which is this notion of that human beings can be captured in this very simple caricature. This very simple caricature that we are, you know, as I say, if you peel away the extras and just go for what you can count on, all you can really count on is that we are self-centered, materialistic, and competitive. And if you really buy that and think that's all you can count on, then it is true that a living democracy, that a way out of this hole that we're digging ourselves deeper and deeper into, is, to me, inconceivable. So we have to challenge, not with some pie in the sky thing, oh yes, human beings are just good by nature, not like that at all. But we have to challenge this out there in the cultural ether, this reductive caricature of humanity. And so I just want to share with you the way that I prefer to do it. I think the first thing is to, every time you hear somebody talking about the problem being greed or selfishness or materialism and consumerism and, it's just our greedy little selves, say, wait a minute. The evidence of history is clear, and we should just drop this whole debate about whether human beings are good or bad. What a distraction that is. Clearly, the history of our species and lab experiments in which we've been the guinea pigs. You know, those experiments, ethics boards don't allow people to do anymore, but they told us a lot about ourselves. Did you study in any of your work here the Stanford prison experiment, for example? Yes, so you get the picture that under the right conditions, that is the wrong conditions, when there are conditions of highly concentrated power, anonymity, and scapegoating, I think those are the three that jump out to me. Under the wrong conditions, human beings, not a few of us, but most of us, will brutalize others. In this prison experiment, normal young people were tested and set in a context of those characteristics, those extreme concentration of power, etc. And this experiment of a mock prison was supposed to last 2 weeks, and the Stanford professor in 1971 had to stop it after 6 days. And he now says that those images that we saw from Abu Ghraib, they reminded him of what he saw in this mock prison among normal kids in 1971. And that's why he testified actually in the Abu Ghraib. My point only is that we know, not a few of us, but most of us will behave very badly in the wrong circumstances. So, what else do we know? We know that we wouldn't have made it to 6.8 billion now if we didn't have powerful pro-social needs and capacities. And so I'm just and those capacities are the ones that now we can count on. They are proven, and both, again, by experimentation and by history, we can count on them if we step up and set the rules to elicit, to unleash those positive qualities and keep in check what we know about our almost universal innate capacity for cruelty. So that's my frame. And I think it's really different from saying, oh, it's the greedy people, it's the selfish people. But let me just say, those pro-social qualities, first, in my mind, they are empathy, cooperation, fairness, and efficacy, power. Empathy, cooperation, fairness, and efficacy. And in each of those, I don't have time today, but in each of those, I can give you, the historical perspective, I think, is very strong. I mean, for example, just in food, we were talking about food security and food sovereignty, that we evolved, as you know, in tribes. 95% of our evolution was as hunter-gatherers. And the anthropologists now tell us that in that tribal evolution, that food sharing was the norm. That when there was food, it wasn't just that the hunters who got the food ate. As long as there was food, everyone ate. And the best hunters shared the most. So clearly we evolved very much as social creatures, and now, for example, when they look at our brains using MRI scans, they find that when we're cooperating compared to when we're competing, that when we're cooperating, as they're looking at our brains, that part of our brains are stimulated when we cooperate, that are the same as when we eat chocolate. And we also have, as I say, this deep capacity for empathy. I like to think that we're at least as empathetic as the rhesus monkey. The rhesus monkey will go for up to 12 days without eating if, in order to eat, it had to press something that gave a small electric shock to another monkey. Fairness. We know that community breaks down without fairness, and we evolved in community, and so we didn't want community to break down. And so even other species, like they tested out the capuchin monkeys, if they think they're getting a raw deal on the rations, from their caretakers, they've been known to throw back their lousy ration and insist on something better. They want a fair deal. Fairness is, as Adam Smith, you remember Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, supposedly the godfather of greed? Actually, he was a profound moral philosopher who said, quote, well, this part isn't a quote, but he said, there are deep social sentiments in us that some of them are optional, but there's one that's not. And he said, we are, quote, in some peculiar manner tied, bound, and obliged to the observation of justice. And my fourth in my list that we can count on is the human need for power. Power defined, let's get over our queasiness about power and define it as our capacity to act, our innate capacity to act, to be creators in the world. And on that note, again, how could we have made it to these complex societies if we weren't fundamentally problem solvers, not couch potatoes? And so I love quoting Erich Fromm, the German social philosopher, who said, let's ditch the René Descartes idea of I think, therefore I am, and point out the obvious, that the real true human essence can be summed up, I am because I affect, because I'm a doer. I make a dent, is what he said. So we have a lot to count on then in terms of human capacities. And so just to reinforce what I'm saying here, so just to summarize this last point, is so we can drop the idea, are we good or bad? We can challenge every time people say, oh, it's just our innate this or that, and we can say, wait a minute, we know human beings can be both. Incredibly, profoundly powerful co-creators and with the emphasis on fairness and sharing and cooperation, or we can brutalize one another in the most despicable ways. And it depends on the rules that you and I set. As we've just seen on Wall Street, for example, we set the rules that brought out the very worst in us and virtually, have lost millions of lives as a consequence of this economic disaster. So, but as soon as I say that, then we get to number 4. And number 4 in this disempowering idea is that, yeah, it would be great if we could do something to change things, but humans hate rules. And so at best, we've got to just force something, in some kind of top-down way, some kind of authoritarian way, force people to do the right thing, because human beings hate rules. And you're saying we need different rules that will bring out the best in us? Well, here's my answer to that. All of you who've been parents, you've all heard this, that little kids feel loved when they have rules. And I think that that kind of applies to everyone. That at every age, it is the rules, a shared sense of boundary that makes us feel connected to one another. And when I say that, I think of marriage vows. I think of the Ten Commandments. I think of the Constitution. I think of the B Corporation, a new concept in which people are recreating the corporate charter so that there are rules that says this corporation, and you can go to B Corporation on the web and read about it and see these companies that are writing the rules so that they are required not just to return the highest, quickest profit to their shareholders, but to benefit all who are touched by their enterprise. So I'm saying that actually humans love rules if we feel they make sense and if we feel that we are included in some way in the community, if not directly in the process of rulemaking, some way we feel a participant. And they can move very fast. So first, I think we should, to get beyond this idea that the humans hate rules, recognize that also that it's kind of a relief, isn't it, to realize that nature gives us a kind of non-arbitrary set of rules that we can look to. We don't have to just debate right versus left. We can say, okay, what is nature telling us here? When we are creating 400 dead zones in the bodies of water around the world because of our industrial-styled chemical agriculture, nature is telling us something, that we're breaking the rules. We're destroying life. So I think one way to deal with this humans hate rules notion is to just recognize what a relief. That there are now non-arbitrary rules that we can study together and that we don't have to debate. They're out there, they're showing us, they're speaking to us, nature is speaking to us. But also recognize how quickly things can move when people feel that a new rule is aligned with their common sense. And the first thing that comes to mind here is San Francisco last year decided to ban plastic bags in certain kinds of stores. And I believe there was, I can't remember the exact number, but there were huge numbers of plastic bags being tossed out in San Francisco every day. And people were really enthusiastic about it. And then the supervisor in San Francisco, who had been the initiator, he said, oh my gosh, we started getting calls from Boston, from this city, that city, that city. Then from Europe, they started calling us. He said, I think we set off a wildfire of common sense. And I love that term, a wildfire of common sense, because it just said, of course we can't go on with this craziness of blanketing the planet with these plastic bags. There's got to be a better way. And of course, it's taking off in many, many countries and municipalities. But I also think of aligning our new rules with that which makes sense to the individual household, that which makes sense to the country and the planet. And the first thing that comes to mind there is Germany, where I just spent glorious 2 weeks and seeing all their windmills. And I think they're quite beautiful. And the key in Germany has been a law, I call it the reward renewables law. They call it in English feed-in tariffs, which is not exactly exciting to me, but what it is, it's reward renewals. It's basically a legal framework that was improved about 10 years ago and really took off, that says if you are a household or a utility or business, you can generate energy and be guaranteed a price. It's going definitely to be purchased at a price that you know going in before you put on those solar cells, the solar panels, that you know what that price is going to be. And it's a price that is going to give you a very good return with a 20-year guarantee. And so it's been working even better than they had imagined. You probably have this operating some places in Canada already, this approach. But already in maybe 15 years or so, Germany now has 15% of its energy its electricity coming from renewables. And this is catching on in many other places. Most recently, not exactly the hotbed of environmental activism, I just heard a report on Gainesville, Florida, where this is taken off. And it didn't require any legislative change. It was just a public utility that decided to do this. And being in Germany, it was just so dramatic. You can drive so far in North America, certainly where I am, and not see one single windmill. And there I just saw them and everywhere, and a lot of them were created, like in this one community I visited, a group of farmers had gotten together and created this. So it is a sense, though, of the part, it allows then regular householders, it's also taking off in Spain big time, to be part of the solution, because the rules were set so that we all could get into it. And similarly, I've been impressed by the Danes, who set the rules so that both cooperatives and individuals were encouraged to put in wind installations. And I calculated recently that now that one out of every 11 Danish households is actually either a direct energy generator, the household, or a member of a cooperative that is generating wind energy. So it's quite remarkable what those changed rules can do. So the final idea that I want to get to of these reframes that I think are so essential to free our energies is that, and I hear this, and I just heard this last trip. I hear people say, you know what, things are so bad. We're going so fast in the wrong direction. There's no time for democracy. We just have to somehow, I don't know how they're going to do it, but that we have no time really to engage people. That we've got to move on a dime, and democracy is too messy and takes too long. Well, I think that actually, of course, I absolutely, completely think that, as you now know, that our only hope for ourselves and our planet is, in fact, the empowerment of people to trust in these pro-social instincts and capacities we have, and to set the rules that bring those out. And that means that we give up on this failed notion of democracy that now we've inherited, what I charitably call thin democracy, or privately held government is more apt. And we together fill in this missing concept. It's what linguists call hypocognition, when people are lacking an idea they need to survive. And we are lacking now, generally speaking, a concept of democracy that's vital enough to turn our planet to life. And that is my passion. How do we redefine democracy? Not as something done to us or for us, but that which we are co-creating. Again, setting the rules that bring out these powerful pro-social capacities. And so, and clearly the theme here is that, yes, I would agree with the critic who says we can't do it with our current definition of democracy, but I would totally disagree thinking that the answer is some authoritarian fix. We know, sort of having an authoritarian in the White House for 8 years who believed himself to be the decider, this kind of bunker mentality, what incredible damage that can do. And again, we can take our cues from the natural world and realize that there is no authoritarian structure in nature, for example. That there's new research on how animal groups make decisions. And I was struck that the whooper swans, is that right? Anyway, these they move as a group according to the female's gaze, and the certain type of deer in Britain turn they move according to when 60% of them rise. And in other words, there's an animal democracy going on here that is very adaptive. And so if we can really trust some of the basic, what we are learning about how the natural world operates, and that it doesn't operate in top-down structures, but it trusts in this networking reality, which is the nature of nature. So to me, what is really essential then is letting go of this failed mechanical notion of democracy, of something done for us, to us, and thinking of democracy as a way of life, not a set system, but a set of system values that permeates every aspect of our lives. I know, for example, here in Canada, you have much more advanced than we do of a restorative justice approach, which is a community-empowered approach to dealing with nonviolent crime. It's an example of how democracy as a living practice permeates the criminal justice system. I see it, for example, in British Columbia, where example of living democracy to me is this use of this large, what I think of as a citizen jury to deliberate. Is everybody aware of that in Canada? Is that generally known? That we in the US have been very impressed with that process, where lay people were informed about all the options and came up with a recommendation for a change in the electoral system, which didn't get quite enough supermajority to actually pass, but it's still being pursued. So this idea of democracy as a set of values that actually works in education, that works in the economic sphere, that works in the political sphere, a set of living values of inclusion, of mutual accountability, not just pointing the finger up there at those greedy people, but mutual accountability of stepping up and creating the rules that bring forth the pro-social in us. And there's much more to be said about that, but I think that the key themes of living democracy as it is showing up in political life, and I'm so excited about the 3 states in the US that have said no to money in politics through clean elections. And so now you can be a waitress, and one of my stories on the website is a waitress in Auburn, Maine, who is now a legislator in the Maine House, or whatever they call it, who is just become an extraordinary leader because because you didn't have to get a lot of money to run for office, because there they have clean elections, as in 3 states in the US now. And so living democracy then is showing up, and I believe that it is possible as we get money out of the system, as we move transparency, make things more and more transparent, which is what Obama has said that he will be doing, although it needs a lot more pushing from citizens. And this process of more direct engagement, as I was suggesting that your example in British Columbia of your Citizens Assembly weighing in is certainly a powerful example of that. So I want to wrap up, though. I want to close with a more personal statement, because this is what I hope you've stayed with me. I've covered a lot of ground, but it can sound so huge. It requires so much change in all of us, and change is frightening for human beings. And so I spent a lot of time thinking, what is the quality that I need to strengthen in myself to be fully alive in this time, when it's so tempting to want to hide under the bed on bad days. So what is the quality that we need? And I've come to call it bold humility. And I'll just summarize briefly what I mean by bold humility. Is that it dawned on me when I went through a period of a great deal of fear that was a great blessing in a way, because then I could see more clearly how fear shows up now in our cultures and how easily it is manipulated. But I could also, the light went on for me when I realized that over that 95% of our evolution, we were in these tribes, and we learned very powerful lessons about fear. We learned that we could trust our body sensations when we had the heartbeat bum, 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 or the hair on end, that meant we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. We'd better fight that lion or get out of there or freeze and hope they don't see us, right? So we learned these very clear lessons about fear. And we also learned that the most scary thing is being banished from the tribe, because that was virtually certain death. So here we are in the 21st century, and I'm suggesting that huge change is needed for all of us, and a lot of that change means that if the hyper tribe is heading over Victoria Falls, that we've got to separate from the tribe, but we're hardwired to believe that that is death, when it means life now. separating from the tribe that is heading toward death, by definition, means life. But it still brings up those fear sensations in most of us, certainly in this one of us. So as all this was dawning on me, I realized that maybe fear too can be seen in part as an idea. And this idea that fear could be an idea came to Anna and me one day when we were in Kenya meeting with a democracy activist. This was during the Moi dictatorship in the year 2000. And we were introduced to this minister, Timothy Njoya, who had been told by the president that he could no longer preach because his sermons were thought to be critical of Arap Moi. And the next Sunday, he had a choice. Did he preach or did he not? And he decided he had to speak his truth, and he was pretty certain that he would be attacked. That night, the assailants came to his house. They broke into his house and started brutally attacking him with swords. And this Timothy Njoya is telling Anna and me the story. And he's kind of bouncing around and acting out part of the attack and laughing. And I'm sitting there just hearing it. My heart is going like this. So I said, "Excuse me, Reverend Njoya, I've got to interrupt you because fear is hardwired. How could it be humanly possible for you to be behaving the way that you did then?" Because what he had just told us is that when he was sure that he was going to die, he started giving away his treasures to his assailants. And I said, no, it just didn't fit my mental map. And so then he said, no, you're wrong. Fear is not out there, it's in here. And he then got up again and he said, it's like the lion that sees the prey. It doesn't just go like that. It recoils and harmonizes its energy, and then it pounces. He said, fear is just energy. We can turn it into paranoia if we want to, or we can turn it into powerful energy to create the world we want. He didn't quite say it like that, but that's what I was getting out of it. So that was a moment, a turning point in my life. And Anna and I stayed up half the night talking about what would it really mean for each of us as we set out on a journey in our sabbatical to make up our existence for a year or whatever it is. Each of us, moment to moment now, we're making it up, right? We know that stakes are so high that we've got to do things differently. We all do. And we know that change is going to bring up fear. And being separate from people who are still locked in, that a lot of those people are going to be people we love. And so that's going to be scary. And so it really was helpful to me to think of really boldness is not getting over fear. Boldness is saying, I can do what I want to do with the energy of it. I never have to get over it. And for me anyway, it's been very liberating to sense that I don't have to get over it. It's okay. I can still move even with it. And so that's the bold part. The final piece is the humility part, which does get a lot easier. I realized when you get into your 60s and you have experience like I did, traveling the world with my daughter and meeting the most amazing examples of living democracy emerging throughout the world. Wangari Maathai, two of our people, by the way, who we put into our book Hope's Edge, have since won a Nobel Peace Prize, so we like to think that we're pretty good choosers of world changers. We get home from that trip, and I realized that every single person and movement and amazing breakthrough that we document in our book Hope's Edge from that trip, every single one, when I was Anna's age, I would have given it almost no chance of success. If somebody had outlined to me, oh yeah, there's going to be a village-level movement of women in Kenya that are going to plant 20 million trees, and part of it is during a dictatorship where their leader is beaten and jailed. Yeah, that's really going to happen. I don't think I would have given it much of a chance. That is what has happened. Now 30 million trees planted by village women. Or land reform, when Joe and Collins and I wrote Food First. Probably the least likely country in the world for successful land reform would have been Brazil. And yet, the Brazilian landless workers movement has settled 1/3 families on 20 million acres of land and are now organic food and new enterprises and wonderful new schools. So, the humility part is this. It's a very simple realization that is the most freeing of all. And that is that it's not possible to know what's possible. It's not possible to know what's possible. And if you really believe that it's not possible to know what's possible, then you really are free. You are free. You are free to think critically about what is go to the deepest roots, not pull back from asking the deepest questions about the economic givens and the psychological assumptions that are behind the mess that we've put ourselves in. You're free, because at this point we do not know. But we do know that because we are now able to enter this ecological worldview in which connectedness, co-creation, as Hans-Peter Dürer says, he's a German physicist, in which there are no parts, only participants. We're entering this new world. We do know something else from neuroscience, and that is that we are each creating each other moment to moment, and that takes it to the next level of each of us as an educator. Because the only choice we have right now is not whether we change the world or not, because we all are. Every moment, every purchase, every act, every employment we take, every way that we live in our homes, that teach our children, we are. So the only choice we have then is not whether to change the world, but how we change the world. And so I would just like to end with a short poem by Denise Levertov, who says this so beautifully and much shorter than I've been blabbing. It's a poem called Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can desire fail? We have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. We have only begun to know what it might be to live as sibling with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We've only begun to know the power that is ours if we would join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. I hope you have questions, and I've been asked to repeat the questions because this is being taped and your voices won't be heard. So maybe when you feel those pounding hearts, recognize its energy. Oh, I didn't tell you my little corny trick, did I? Yeah, my little corny trick about fear is that when I saw Inconvenient Truth and Al Gore appeared, and I was so afraid because everybody in the room was so kind of in a collective bow, and I was feeling extremely angry at him because I didn't feel he really nailed the message. And so my heart started really pounding really, really hard. And so I said, oh, that means that maybe I really got to do something. And I realized I've got to rename that my inner applause. And so now when I feel that pounding heart, that means, oh, wow, what an opportunity. You're right there where you can really show yourself your real stuff, rather than, in the past when I would feel that, I'd say, oh, you wimp, So anyway, I hope you have questions, please. Yes, please. Oh, that's such an interesting question. The question is, the Canadian Association for Food Studies is in a debate framed as rights and responsibilities, as how do we shape policy weighing people's rights and responsibilities. Yes. The individual versus the collective. And I feel, and I haven't thought about it before, so this is rough-hewn, but my instinct is to feel that this is very much the framing, the rights versus responsibility, the collective individual, is very much framed as part of the mechanical worldview of separateness and the old democracy point of view, the thin democracy, that democracy is a burden, that it's like the spinach we eat to get our dessert of freedom, that democracy is the untasty stuff. And so I'd love to talk to you, and I'd have to know a whole lot more about how to operationalize what I'm about to say. But the more that we can reframe democracy as not a burden of that the free people must bear, but as the good life, as being engaged and with, because we are social creatures. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons that the real pandemic in the world today is depression, it's now the 4th leading cause of loss of productive life, is because people feel excluded and voiceless and not part of creating their communities. So the rights and responsibilities still is in that spinach versus dessert kind of thing for me. And kind of also, so the term that I like to use more and more is this idea of the value of mutual accountability, that none of us is simply a giver or a receiver, and none of us should ever just be a finger pointer. And I think liberals are just as guilty as as conservatives of being, the finger pointer. Oh, it's it's George Bush, or it's Osama bin Laden. And so the more that we can create cultures and language to reflect that we all want to be part of the solution, and that's a good thing. We all want to shoulder responsibility because that means we have power. I mean, another word for responsibility is power. That's why I'm so delighted by the reward renewables law, that framing in Germany that's now catching on, and the way that the Danes went about it. They didn't say, oh, it's your responsibility to put up a windmill. It put the frame in such a way that, as I said, 1 in 11 householders now feels that it's to their advantage. So I'm sure I'm not giving you kind of specifics, but I'd love to talk about it more, and it's really interesting. Yes. Ooh. So to summarize that, it's a great question. I think, boil it down, tell me if this is it. I'll say, what you're asking me is, fundamentally, do we engage with those, the pinnacle, at the center of concentrated power within capitalism as we know it today? Or do we just try to do things that will eventually, hopefully, the islands that rise up? I think of it as like islands rising up, and then they start connecting, and suddenly the whole terrain is different, and not focus on them. And I think my answer to that is that the reason that the Waltons exist in our country, the reason that we've gone back to the pre-Depression era in so many levels in terms of concentration of wealth and the deepening of poverty, is, again, because of the power of ideas, that we have been just drip, drip, drip with ideology telling us that the market can do no harm, government can do no good, and that therefore we have to completely withdraw, and the only term of art used is, of course, regulation, which sounds very constraining. My term that I prefer is standards. Let's create standards around the market. So my answer is that it's sort of neither do we just attack the Waltons, nor do we just focus on just the bottom-up community building, the wonderful CSA movement, and all of those wonderful things, although, yes, there's a place for us in all of these. But we can also be looking systemically, asking, how is it that we never caught on to what Lizzie Magie was telling us, that the reason that Waltons are where they are, not because they're particularly brilliant, because of our political system in the U.S. allowed the total sidelining of any antitrust, and the subsidies and the encouragement of our economy was going to the big box operations much more than to the Main Street and to the small, to the cooperatives and small proprietors. It's not. Again, you don't have to have a PhD in economics to understand how our economic rules have gotten twisted to enable Waltons to emerge, and therefore we as societies have to remake those rules. And to do that, peeling back that layer, we have to remove the power of private wealth from our public decision making. I mean, when you just think about it, that we're still we are still something like $300 billion a year are still subsidizing fossil fuels throughout the world. And yet we know fossil fuels are literally killing the planet. And yet our tax money is still subsidizing them. How did that happen? It happens because of the power of oil companies and other fossil fuel industry, and now the nuclear and all, in our political system. So I think just keeping on that, I can't underscore this enough. For example, I just got a questionnaire from this group that arose out of the great successful neighborhood organizing that Obama did, and they sent people who contributed to Obama and this questionnaire about what are our issues. Oh, they didn't mention the issue of money in politics. You know, that's not, even though there now in our Congress are 2 laws which would make a big step toward removing the power of money in politics. And so I think, I hope I'm answering your question, that what I'm saying that the mother of all issues in one sense, in my view, is who makes the decision, and if that is if that's decided by who's got the biggest bucks, then we cannot create this planetary health on which all of our future and other species depend. And so whatever else we're doing, whatever beautiful campaigns you're part of and careers you're doing, just take some time to figure out here in Canada, and that's what I'm telling US audience, what step, because I'm sure it's not as bad here as it is where we are with the 16 million a day spent on lobbying, but I'm sure it's a factor. So what can you do? I mean, even if it's not your main thing, spend some time each month or each year, focusing on that, and speaking about it, because I just feel that basically that who makes the decisions is fundamental, because the decisions will be made in the interest of those who are at the table. As somebody's been quoted a lot recently saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So how do we get citizens' voices at the table? So, but these are wonderful, hard questions. So, yes, please. In order for the positives to emerge, we have to eliminate a lot of the really negative, like genetically modified organisms.
You can't just say
Right.
that companies can do things in a voluntary way. It has to be more controlled.
Okay, so voluntary, asking corporations to voluntarily act is not enough, because the questioner points out that organic, you can want to be organic, but if you have genetically modified fields near you, it's very likely that you will have mixed, that will drift. Genetic drift. So I'm so glad you asked this, because I want to make clear, when I gave the example of the B Corporation, that is a very small movement. That is not about, it is about corporations who are incorporating legally to require that that it's part of a whole movement to return corporations to their original intent, which was to serve the common good. That's, as many of you know, that this whole idea that corporation is just there to serve the interest of the shareholders is a pretty recent idea in history. And so this is a movement that is saying that we, and still now a very small portion, but it's showing that you can have those legal requirements on you and still be a very successful company. So in that sense, it's a model, it's a case study in refuting the idea that businesses can only work if they destroy the environment, which is kind of just a crazy notion to begin with. So I see them as simply, what would you call it, an object lesson in what's possible, not, at this point, certainly they're not the solution. No, I strongly believe that we have to have very, very clear legislation. I just know that we have to come up with better language, and I think talking always about regulation, because people have been so brainwashed to think of regulation always as negative, but the word standards, people generally think standards are a good thing. So if our standard is that we don't introduce any seed that hasn't been, that we don't need and that hasn't been proven, certainly in long human studies, not to be harmful, then of course we wouldn't do it. And GMOs do not pass that test. So So yes, I believe absolutely that we have to come together now more than ever to protect the public against all sorts of harms and create much more clear-cut bans on, I mean, I'm sure you all know, in the US, for example, we still are using, oh my gosh, what is that pesticide that's everywhere?
DDT?
No, Roundup, but no, there's, it's on all the corn.
BGA?
Atrazine, thank you. That has been banned in Europe for a long time, right? And it's everywhere. So, no, I'm really glad you said that, because I don't want to be misunderstood. Absolutely. I think, as I was saying, I think people that inherently dislike rules. They like rules that make sense. And certainly it makes sense to have a rule that says my grandbaby's bubble bath is not going to be something that's going to cause her cancer. You know, I mean, that people get, and people are very eager now in terms of food safety and especially around food and agriculture. So I'm totally with that. But I think we do need to work on more effective ways of talking about it and spreading the word about, say, the dangers of GMOs, because in the US, you know, do you have labeling of GMOs here? You know that even in China, totalitarian China, I read that they have labels, and we don't? I mean, it's crazy. So, thank you. Yes, sir. So the question is, using Walmart as a case in point, that is incorporating more organic, but because it brings high street turn to the Walton family and others, not for benefit of all of us, and it undercuts prices, so makes prices for organic lower that could undercut small family organic producers. And so how do we not get co-opted into saying, well, that's good, you know, that they're doing this? Well, what I wish I had ended my talk with is, at the end of Getting a Grip, I have 5 questions, a little checklist that I think I'll throw out there as my checklist of how we should judge developments and what we commit our lives to and what we support and how. And it is, in a sense, looking at the world through a power map. And I don't mean power as most of us grow up thinking of it as coercive and mean-spirited or selfish. I mean empowerment. I mean our capacity to act, to come together to be. And what we know about power, and this, I think, we can't say to each other enough. What we know about power is that when it's concentrated, even initially in benign hands, it ends up with bad results. That throughout history, and this is the pattern, that concentrated power, it goes to people's head and they lose their perspective. And that dispersed, distributed power is wiser, that you have more input, you have more checks and balances and all the things that we know are essential. So like Whole Foods, for example. Whole Foods co-president, it's actually somebody I know. He's a wonderful man. He was inspired by Diet for a Small Planet. But I mention Whole Foods, just so you know, in Getting a Grip, and say, look, yeah, even though Whole Foods, you know, I always ask people when I'm in Whole Foods, well, how do you like working here? And it's a more benign place to work than other places and all of that. But it's still concentrated power, increasingly concentrated power. It's really the only big chain left in the US that sells a lot of Whole Foods. So we've got to get better, and I'm not saying I've got all the answer by any means, but we've got to get better at rethinking power, and that's how I have a chapter in this little book about power, and how we learn to think of power in the positive as something that is co-created, and then we're not deluded to think, oh yes, it's great because, you know, Walmart is going organic. It doesn't matter if they control 40%, you know, as much as 40% as much as whatever statistic I gave you. The Walton family has as much wealth as the bottom 40% of the population put together. I mean, we've got to see that that's a problem. It's a problem on many levels, that it creates scarcity for others, that it deprives, that it concentrates the economic activity away from the small town development, but it also just creates, ultimately, communities that none of us can thrive in. So that's my real answer, and I've got to get it, I agree, I've got to get it better. But if you walk away with nothing else, it's sort of seeing the world through this, does it empower? Does this strategy I'm working on, does it empower people? And if you look at the history of GMOs, you see that was complete power grab. That was, the Monsantos and all going into Washington and sitting down behind closed doors and sidelining the real scientists who were raising. It was a complete power play. There was nothing in the democratic dialogic process in that. And that is creating disastrous results for our ecology and for people. Yes, please. Well, I think what is happening, the question was, how does what I'm saying today relate to all the work that my focus has been on food and farming and hunger in the world? And I see this framework that I'm presenting this afternoon as the way to understand why there is hunger in the world and why there are at least 100 million more people today than there were 2 years ago. It is a consequence of exactly this global capitalist system, and I think that there are many ways to organize a market. I'm not against a market economy. I'm against a one-rule market economy, and one of the most evident, the consequences of it, the most gruesome consequences, is the deepening hunger. So, and the incredible waste in our food system, as that was my first aha, as you probably know, sitting in that UC Berkeley Ag Library at age 25 and saying, wait a minute here, they're telling us we'd hit the Earth's limits to feed people, and actually we are creating scarcity. We are feeding 16 pounds of grain and soy to get just 1 pound of beef back. So what's wrong with this picture? And then I realized that it wasn't that I was particularly smart, or I didn't have any degree in economics or in food and nutrition or in agricultural development, but it was just, if you look at it with fresh eyes and you see how this one rule economy creates scarcity out of plenty. And then you take the lens of empowerment in a liberation ecology framework which is all based on the alignment with nature. And I just wrote a piece I'd love to send you if you'd be interested, a short piece I wrote for Boston University for a issue paper series there about rethinking the hunger question. And I got so excited about reading about what's happening in West Africa, which none of us, at least up until that point, I hadn't read about, where things were getting so bad and people said, wait a minute, our ancestors lived here and they didn't have this hard-packed soil that's unplantable, and how did they do it? How did they keep regenerating life here in the soil? And they started reintroducing ancient these small ditches in the fields that put manure in, and then they started generating new fertility. And one of the statistics in there is about a 12.5 million acre expanse, mainly in Niger, I believe, where the small farmers, very poor people, have reclaimed that much land for agriculture and for generally healthy ecology with trees to keep the soil and all. So I'm saying that exactly all the things that I said in my talk are both the cause and the hope in terms of world hunger. And I also talk about Andhra Pradesh in India, which was one of the sufferers with the state that incredible suicide rates, as the Monsanto cotton really wasn't paying off. And so they've gone now away from pesticides, away from GMOs, and they're creating not necessarily fully organic, but very much, they call it non-pesticide management. And it's creating these local economies where women are making these potions out of chilies and cow dung and urine and various neem tree extracts to use as pest deterrents instead of the imported chemicals. And so these are the stories that we have to get out to make the case that instead of being the savior, instead of GMOs being the savior, or corporate agriculture being the savior, that this structure is what is generating scarcity and generating the hunger for now millions of more people. And to tell these stories about what is happening that are still so invisible. So that's what I hope that, one of the things that I hope that you'd come from a talk like this, that I feel that we each have to spend some time every week at least looking for a story of possibility that we're going to share with somebody, because my inbox fills up, as yours, I'm sure, with the latest horror, and very rarely do I get something, oh, look at this, in West Africa, they've done this. Nobody put that in my inbox. So these are the stories that, and again, all of us are educators, and we can say, hey, did you hear about that? And just tweak that mental map and away from the sense that we're dependent. And eventually, the people in Africa are going to have to say no to this outside control of their land. They're going to have to take the kind of risk that the Brazilians have taken to reclaim land. They changed the constitution in Brazil to help them. So thank you very much. Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. The question, one part of the question was, do I know anything about the Union of Concerned Scientists, whether or not as an organization they're continuing to take a position and work in the area of women's right to choose an abortion. I don't know the answer to that. I don't, but now I'm very curious, so I'll find out. On the larger question of how women's empowerment connects to, including controlling our fertility, how that connects to all the other issues is really a more broad question. I certainly share the feeling behind the question that one of the things that most frustrates me when I still, after all these years, still I get hands in the back of the auditorium saying, but you haven't talked about population, as the real problem. And so I try to point out that population growth is a symptom of the disempowerment of people. And if you're really serious about, in fact, I wrote a little book, co-authored a little book in the 80s called Taking Population Seriously. If you're really serious about bringing population into balance with the natural world, then the strategy is to empower people, particularly women. And you see the enormous change, even with a country like India, if you compare the states where women are more educated and where women have more opportunities in terms of employment, you see a much lower fertility rate than you do with the opposite statistics in other states. So I see it, that I think my answer there is that anybody's talking about population as a concern, which of course it is. We definitely, even though there is more than enough now to, as I say, make us all chubby, at one point, as long as we are not empowering people, especially women, so that they can make the decisions that are best for them and their communities, then we will hit the absolute limits. Absolutely, of course. So I think it's just another way of talking about this is it's another reason why we have to put on the power lens, so to speak, and think about every activity that we're engaged in terms of how it particularly empowers women. And one of the greatest breakthroughs there has been now what is called social lending, what started with the microcredit movement in big time in Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, but now is spreading throughout the world in much less capital-intensive ways, if you will, and with no real banks, but just women in groups creating lending circles. And I guess I'll just end my answer to that question with saying that the thing that, if there's one thing that most inspires me as I stand before you right now, and I don't know how it's been covered in Canada, but it's these images of these young girls in Afghanistan who some of their classmates were disfigured with acid, and these girls did not stop coming to school. At first, the principal was too afraid, they closed the school, and the parents were too afraid, they kept everybody home, and then they reversed it. Again, the fear factor. They walked with their fear, and even the girls who were really disfigured, they didn't just say, oh, I'm too ashamed, they came to school and they were accepted. To me, any way that we can just blast out, that the message of that courage of those girls and what that would mean for the country of Afghanistan if those girls, and then there's a young woman in the legislature, right, who's gotten all sorts of death threats, and to really really be there for people like those girls any way that we can, through any NGOs we're connected to or any other women's networks. That's I think, how, it's going to change.
Francis, there's time for one last question.
Time for one question. Can you make the final choice? Maybe I'll defer. Beautiful. Yes. Oh, yes. Yes. And so I think your question is a great one to end with, and I certainly agree with you, have experienced that somewhat in my own life, although I'm still working on keeping my you-know-what on the cushion. But I do agree with you, and these traditions have been enormously helpful to me. And I think one of the reasons that meditation is so powerful, and now there's a wonderful book I recommend to you all. It's, you have to read it a few pages at a time, but it's so motivating about meditation. It's called The Mindful Brain by a Stanford, I think, academic. Anyway, it's a beautiful book about all that they're learning about how meditation affects the brain. And if we're really talking about seeing the world with new eyes, then your point is absolutely to the point. And meditation actually does change creates new connections. And if we're saying that part of the problem is that we've just been programmed into these old patterns, old connections, then meditation is a powerful way to help just to make way for some new ones. And allow that what I call the beginner's eyes, which was a lot easier to have when I was 25. And like I love Jane Goodall pointing out, because it was so similar to my own experience. Jane Goodall says that she was chosen to go watch the chimps because she didn't have a PhD. She hadn't, been trained not to see certain things. So she started seeing things that the PhDs didn't. I mean, she did go ahead and get her degree, but meditation is one way to help us just be as free as we can anyway of the learned patterns, so that we can have those flashes of insight. And you've asked absolutely fabulous questions, and you've confirmed my wonderful experience in Canada. And I just ask you finally again to consider weighing in on our website, comments, anything you've heard, and if you'd be interested in reading a draft of this book that will probably be ready in draft form in August. It's going to be a little book, not a mammoth book, a monster book. So just let me know, and I could email it to you and get your feedback. And thank you so very much. Thank you, and thank you, Trish.